Welcome to today's talk by Kahn Strauss on the erosion of the rule of law in Nazi Germany. I'm Manfred Philipp, and I'd like to thank the people and organizations that have co-sponsored this event. These include Amr Dumachik of the German Academic Exchange Service Alumni Association, Josephine Dorado and Tom Agustin of the Fulbright Association, John Torpy of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies of the CUNY Graduate Center, Sarah Danielson of the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and Sciences, Jewel Escobar of the Bell Zeller Scholarship Fund, and Elke Nicolai of the German Department at Hunter College. Our speaker today is an alumna of Hunter College and Hunter College High School. One of my duties in arranging this talk would normally be to introduce the speaker. However, I was more than pleased when Consul General David Gill agreed to do this. Before I turn this over to Mr. Gill, let me say a few words about the Consul General himself, since he has a personal history that you probably would like to hear about. David Gill has served as German Consul General in New York since August 2017. He grew up in East Germany, where he initially studied theology at a seminary run by the Protestant Church. He was not allowed to study at a state university for political reasons. He participated in the peaceful revolution that helped bring down the Berlin Wall. After German reunification, he worked with others on saving the records of the East German secret police, the Stasi. One can't overestimate the importance of that work. The academic freedom he gained in a reunified Germany allowed him the chance to study law at the Free University of Berlin. His studies also brought him to the United States, where he received the LLM law degree at the University of Pennsylvania. Once his legal clerkship was completed, he began working as an advisor to the German government and for the German Protestant Church. David Gill then became head of the office of the German federal president, Joachim Gauck, ending his work there in February 2017. Several months later, he was appointed Consul General in New York. He and his wife, Sheila, have 2 daughters. Let me welcome Consul General Gill and thank him for participating in today's presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it is an honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, and I do it with great admiration. Kahn Strauss is a woman who dedicated her life and career to the remembrance and preservation of the German-speaking Jewry, to its beauty and achievements, as well as its tragedy and extermination. She's a woman who has lived for reconciliation and the prospect of German-Jewish relations, a woman who is brilliant in bringing people together and building networks, a woman of great commitment and passion. Personal experiences combined with professional knowledge are the foundation of Carol's successes and achievements. This will become apparent today when she talks about the erosion of law in Nazi Germany. While Carol was born in New York, she grew up in an environment where the German language and culture was present, which ensured that she never lost the connection to this important part of her ancestry. Her father was an esteemed lawyer in the city of Dortmund, president of one of its courts. As a Jewish lawyer, he experienced the erosion of law in the very early stage of the Nazi rule in Germany. As a result, Carol's parents had to flee Germany in 1938, but they were careful to preserve the language and culture for their child. For many years, Carol worked as an editor for several think tanks and was also active in the Jewish community in Manhattan as president of the congregation Habonim. In 1994, she joined Leo Baeck Institute. which she served for more than 20 years, most of the time as executive director. Thanks to her leadership, the LBI became a well-regarded, highly relevant, and the largest research library and archive of 19th and 20th century German language Jewish culture. And she worked tirelessly to strengthen the ties between the LBI and Germany, between American Jewry in Germany, and America and Germany in general. During her tenure, LBI opened an office in Berlin to further foster this relationship. And Carol knows everybody in Berlin and Germany, literally. From the Chancellor to the President, to ministers and Lord Mayors, Director of museums, members of the Parliament, artists, philanthropists, and religious leaders. For her dedication, she received, beside many other honors, the Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany twice. The second time, when she received the Outstanding Commander's Cross bestowed upon her by Federal President Joachim Gauck, I even had the honor to be part of the awarding process as Gauck's Chief of Staff. It is my great pleasure to present to you my dear and appreciated friend, Carol Kahn Strauss.
Yes, I would like, first of all, to extend sincere thanks to Manfred Philipp for inviting me to participate in this program this afternoon, and also sincere thanks to the co-sponsors, the DAAD Alumni Association and John Torpy and the Ralph Bunche Institute, the German Consulate, and of course, most especially to Consul General David Gill for that very, very gracious and generous introduction. I think Germany gave New York an enormous, great gift when they sent someone as engaged in the social, cultural, diplomatic society of America and New York in particular when they sent David Gill, and I am very appreciative. Thank you so much. My topic is the erosion of the rule of law in Nazi Germany, but I think it's useful to begin the story somewhat before they were Nazis and even before there was a Germany. There were Jews settled along the Rhine as early as the Middle Ages, but most accounts of German Jewish history begin with Moses Mendelssohn, a young rabbinic scholar who followed his teacher to Berlin in 1743. He passed through the only gate in Berlin that permitted Jews to enter. It was also the gate for swine and cattle, and like them, a tax was imposed on each Jew. At the time, Prussia was ruled by Frederick II, who proclaimed a, quote, reign of reason at his coronation in 1740, declaring that all religions must be tolerated because all were equally false. This early history seems a good place to begin a brief discussion of the erosion of the rule of law, because just as Jews were subjected to special and degrading treatment in the 18th century, so it was in the 20th. Jews were accustomed to being excluded from the body politic. There were always laws and statutes to ensure their status as second-class citizens. It is also a good place to note that, contrary to the common perception, that under the Nazis, laws did not matter. On the contrary, a carefully structured legal system continued to exist as it always had. Moses Mendelssohn's intention was to end the social and intellectual isolation of Judaism. And within the context of the Enlightenment, his ideas of rational discourse leading to greater tolerance had some resonance. The Society for the Scientific Study of Judaism, or Wissenschaft des Judentums, was the response created by some of Berlin's more prominent Jewish intellectuals to more closely align Jewish studies to the German heritage of science, literature, and philosophy. By putting Judaism in a more secular context, their hope was that Germans would recognize that the German identity of Jews was as strong as their Jewish identity. Many German families, in fact, celebrated Easter and Christmas, not as religious holidays, but as German folk festivals, and many actually converted. They were not very religious Jews, and they became not very religious Christians. By the late 19th century, the stability of the German state, economically, politically, and militarily, seemed secure enough to permit Jews greater civil rights than they had enjoyed until then. In fact, they had more legal standing in Germany than in England or in France after the Dreyfus affair, or in Tsarist Russia or in Austria-Hungary. German Jews acknowledged this improvement in their status by becoming noticeably more patriotic. One reason Theodor Herzl's Zionist movement, his attempt to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, never gained much foothold in Germany was because for most of them, they felt they already had a homeland. And in World War I, they signed up and fought for the fatherland. As the war dragged on and the population was becoming increasingly disheartened, there was, of course, a resurgence of anti-Semitism, which was always the default position. If Jews were shirking their responsibilities and avoiding the front lines, as was the rumor, in 1916, the Prussian War Ministry ordered a census of all German units. In fact, the census found that Jews were disproportionately serving and falling at the front. The results of the census, not surprisingly, were suppressed. Let me stop here for a moment to even offer my credentials for this talk. My father was one of the very young soldiers who enlisted to fight for the fatherland, and perhaps more importantly, in the context of a talk on the erosion of the rule of law, my father was a very young judge who was immediately disbarred. My uncle was a pediatrician who was forced to give up his medical practice. And my grandfather had his sizable textile business Aryanized and taken over by the Nazis. And there was legislation to accommodate all of these crimes. I was for more than 20 years executive director of Leobeck Institute, a research library and archive that documents German Jewish history and culture. In the LBI collections, there are so many documents that attest to the legality of this criminal activity. To recap briefly, the Nazis came to power in January 1933 when the elderly German president Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler chancellor. He had already dismissed 4 chancellors in less than a year, so few thought that Hitler would fare any better. But Hitler immediately called for the dissolution of the Reichstag, or the parliament, and ordered new elections. In a matter of weeks, the Reichstag was burned to the ground very suspiciously, and the chancellor, assuring the people that this was a communist plot, persuaded the elderly von Hindenburg to pass an emergency decree, the Reichstag Fire Ordinance, that eliminated civil liberties, primarily for communists, but also for Catholics, opposition party, members, trade unionists, and all other actual or imagined political opponents. Freedom of expression was rendered null and void, as was freedom of the press and freedom of assembly. The deeply divided political extremes of right and left, National Socialists and Communists, were as much the subject of these draconian laws as were the Jews. Opposition in any form was no longer tolerated. The state would destroy anything it labeled as a nefarious plot against it. As Hitler watched the Reichstag burn to the ground, he supposedly shouted, "We will show no mercy anymore. Whoever gets in our way will be slaughtered." This fire is the beginning of a great new epoch in German history. Germans were invited to tour the ruins to hear the Nazi guides give their version of events, which from now on would be the only version of events. The Weimar years were over. It was now the Third Reich. Political violence was unleashed on a massive scale, carried out by a political army of loyal and disciplined followers who blindly followed the Führer's dictates. By March 1933, just 3 months after coming to power, Hitler obtained an amendment to the Weimar Constitution, known as the Enabling Act, which in effect gave him the power to enact laws without the consent of the Reichstag. With this act, the government turned itself into a legal dictatorship, with legal scholars helping them to destroy the idea of individual liberty. Persecution, terror, and mass destruction were all sanctioned by the new laws. In July 1933, the government passed a law making the Nazi Party the only political party in Germany. This is also when the most concerted efforts began to marginalize Jews, starting with the attempt to ban Jews from German economic life. In the years between 1933 and 1938, boycotts, forced sales, and bankruptcies reduced the number of Jewish-owned businesses by 2/3. The legal profession didn't take 5 years to decimate. By April 1933, Jewish judges, lawyers, law professors, and civil servants throughout the judiciary system were stripped of their right to practice law. Their contributions that had been made over many years to commercial law, penal law, contract law, family law, criminal procedures, women's rights, and free speech became totally irrelevant. Perhaps it would be useful to clarify that Jews were a very small minority of the German population. In 1933, they constituted less than 1%, or fewer than 600,000 in a population of 6 million. They were, however, disproportionately represented in the legal and medical professions, in finance, in the arts, among entrepreneurs, and as business owners. They were also disproportionately philanthropic, funding hospitals and orphanages, museums and orchestras, and social welfare agencies. But most Germans assumed that there were millions of Jews visible everywhere. They were obviously responsible for World War I. They were the demons in the punishing Treaty of Versailles. They were responsible for the rampant inflation, for the so-called degradation of society under the Weimar Republic, and for the general malaise that was by now affecting all of Europe. It was with great speed and efficiency, therefore, that the Nazis acted on their plan to eliminate Jews. One of the first major pieces of legislation, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, effectively eliminated Jews from holding any state jobs. This was a federal law, but it was enhanced by state, regional, and municipal edicts that further restricted Jewish rights. These restrictions ranged from trivial to tragic. Jews could no longer fly the German flag. They could no longer own pets. They could no longer use public parks. They could no longer own a car or obtain a driver's license. They could no longer buy lottery tickets. They could no longer own radios, typewriters, or bicycles. Through these incremental measures, obviously Jews became increasingly marginalized. There was a radical redefinition of belonging, of who was a part of German society. The idea of Volksgemeinschaft was enacted into law, where purity of race was the primary determinant. Racial identity became the basis of public policy, and Hitler was beyond skillful at dividing Germans into Germans and others. Hitler's appeal to popular fears and resentments was orchestrated by orations that struck some as being almost obscene. One biographer described the quote, copulatory character of his talks, almost silent at the beginning, followed by short, shrill yappings, minor climaxes, and finally oratorical orgasms of ecstasy. Hitler was also a master of political theater, staging marches, events, and rallies that were a useful distraction from the brown-shirted thugs just outside the arena. The 1935 Nuremberg laws excluded Jews from citizenship and prohibited relations by Jews with any person of German blood. Political rights were immediately rescinded so Jews could not vote. Didn't matter, there was only one political party. Whether or not you were considered Jewish depended on a complex set of family relationships. Was one grandparent Jewish? Were two? Your religious practice of the moment, whether you were a practicing Jew or a non-practicing Jew, converted or baptized, became irrelevant. With increasing marginalization, dislocation, and removal from the mainstream of German society, obviously Jews became less and less visible. From there to extinction was not a giant leap, nor was it illegal due to the perversion of the entire system. Citizens became increasingly inured to the daily injustice going on around them. By the time of the Wannsee Conference in 1942, that drafted the final solution, most Germans had long ago stopped paying attention. A British historian named Jonathan Friedman noted the irony that Germans had a strong allegiance to written laws and a desire for policies to be law-based. There is a story that when Hermann Goering suggested to propaganda minister Goebbels that German passengers could simply tell Jewish passengers to get off a train if the train became too crowded, Goebbels supposedly said, "I don't believe in this. There is no law that allows it." Jewish theologians have often noted that the Bible recognizes our need to live in a law-governed universe, but also recognizes that human beings are often compelled to break the law or, given a choice, make the wrong one. But because laws do seem natural and necessary, they are often obeyed, and that blind obedience can have tragic outcomes. Ernest Fraenkel, a German jurist and political scientist, published an important book in 1941 called The Dual State. In it, he characterized the Nazi political system as a dual state in which a so-called normative state coexisted with the so-called prerogative state. The laws and policies of the normative state allowed for the continuation of normal life for most Germans in most places. In the prerogative state, the Nazis preserved their prerogative to enact legal sanctions and whatever other means they found necessary to deal with so-called enemies of the state, primarily Jews, but also homosexuals, gypsies, Catholics, and trade unionists. A state governed by the rule of law demands political participation, and political participation includes dissent. When state institutions assume unlimited and arbitrary powers, there will always be some who recognize that there is no justice when atrocities are sanctioned by the rule of law. In Munich, a group of young university students, not Jewish and not anti-Hitler, came to recognize that everything they had been educated to believe was being turned on its head. The moral imperative to behave responsibly, to recognize evil, forced them out of silence into action. Calling themselves the White Rose, They published a series of pamphlets which they distributed as widely as they could. The leaflet said, quote, "Every German today is ashamed of their government, a government that committed crimes that far outdistance every human measure, and all those who remain silent are complicit." "We will not be silent," they wrote. "We are your bad conscience." The members of the White Rose movement were executed the same day they were caught. The law-abiding, authority-respecting Germans were indeed complicit. The long and illustrious history of Jews in Germany never ensured them a secure place in society, so the Nazis could erode the legal guarantees without much opposition. A few weeks ago, there was a banner headline in the New York Times that declared, "The president is not above the law." The problem with this supposedly reassuring assertion is that when the law itself has been subverted to become a political weapon, those who obey it and those who flout it are equally guilty. In the important new book called Hitler's First 100 Days, there is a deceptively simple sentence tucked away in the pages of this heavy volume. It says, quote, "The lack of civil courage in defense of an open society was striking." Thank you.